Dothan, Alabama. That's where the cotton grows tall. The folks say y'all, and the peanut grows all over. And he mentioned he forgot to mention another part of my education. I did go to law school for a year, but I couldn't take the racism, and it was in Illinois, the University of Illinois. But anyway, we opened Vaughn's bookstore in Detroit in 1959. It was the second black bookstore to open in America, and we did quite a bit there at Vaughn's bookstore. And I'm very pleased to say that a lot of people would come to Vaughn's and buy their books, and we were the first in the state of Michigan to sell the Holy Quran. We did a lot of firsts there. Of course, in 1967, during the rebellion, the Detroit police burned my store down, and we know about that also. And it was trial and tribulations all those years that I was there. I served 10 years for Mayor Coleman Young as executive assistant, and the way I got to be executive assistant is Coleman wasn't too pleased with me because he knew I was really independent, and I couldn't toe the line like folks did around there. So he sent me out to the public lighting department, and so I worked at public lighting, and it was a huge department, and I was the commission administrative coordinator, and which was really kind of a nothing job thrown away somewhere. And I asked Coleman, I said, well, Mr. Mayor, why you send me out there? He said, well, when I was a kid, they used to be the Klan in Detroit. They would get their big lighting trucks and come around the neighborhood and harass us. And he said, I just don't like them. And so he sent me out there. He sent me out there. And so I was the third man in line. And the director and the executive director, the vice director, they thought that I was coming there to get them fired. And so whatever I did, it was okay with them. And so what I realized is that the black community had no lighting. Their alleys weren't lit up. It was dark. So since they were afraid of me, and I started posting, well, I'm from the mayor's office, and we got to get lights in this alley. I lit up every black neighborhood in Detroit. I mean, from one end of the city to the other. And they were just jumping for me. And I thought that was really great. And people wrote letters in, and so the mayor brought me downtown to be executive assistant. I did that for about 10 years till he got tired of that and the things that I was doing in terms of organizing in the city. So anyway, I left after that. But it's been a great run for me. And since I've been back in Alabama, I've been working on a monument to Dr. George Washington Carver in Dothan. And of course, he was the first person to speak at the Peanut Festival in 1938, and he couldn't live in the white hotels, so he lived in the home of my first grade school teacher, who lived next door to me. And of course, after that, I came back home. I bought the house and I turned it into a museum of African American history in Dothan, Alabama. So if you're ever down that way, stop in to see my museum. But anyway, I've been teaching African and African American history all these years, and several of my students here. Students, raise your hands while I talk. Hey, I see hands right there.
There's a hand.
Anyway, I taught in several different locations. And the reason I was able to teach at Wayne State University, Lawrence Technological University, and the rest of them, and I lectured at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and Michigan State in East Lansing. But the reason was that the students were demanding that African and African American history be taught. And that was the reason that those universities hired me to teach. And I'll never forget, I taught in the Graduate School of Social Work at Wayne State University. And one of my favorite students was Lonnie Peak. So anyway, in teaching African and African American history, I came to understand well that the human family is monogenetic, meaning that we all came from one source, and that source was Mother Africa. And that many people have been trying to make one thing or another about our color, our hair texture, and everything. But we were people who were born, the human family began in Africa, near the equator, in what is called Oda Gorge. And of course, Dr. Leakey has done a lot of research there, and he is a European. And when he came back to live in Kenya, they asked him, why are you coming back to Kenya? You're European, you're white, why are you coming back to Kenya? He said, I'm just coming back home. And that's where the human family was born. Now, how do we know that that's where the human family was born? Because something happened a few years ago called deoxyribonucleic acid. That's the DNA. And they found out that every human being on God's earth can trace their ancestry back to one black woman who lived in Africa 230,000 years ago. Now that's every person on earth.
Come on now.
Every person on earth. But why do we look different today? Why are some people dark skinned? Why are some people light skinned? Why are some people so-called white? Well, the reason for that is migration. When the human family began to migrate from where the human family began, we began to move east. And of course, at the time, the indigenous characteristics of people who lived in those particular areas. So that was the reason we had change in color. Now, I've been to Africa, both East and West Africa, and let me tell you, if you ain't black in Africa, I'm sorry, dark skinned, and you on that equator, that sun will tear your butt apart. And so the people were dark skinned, the human family. And so as they began to move north, across the Mediterranean into around Italy and those are places, they began to darken up, and their characteristics began to change. And as they moved further north into Scandinavia, now they were very fair skinned, and these people we call white people. But basically, the human family is monogenetic, and we should always remember that we are one people. Now, hair. Let me tell you something about hair. Now, in Africa, if you ain't got no good hair, so the human family began. I said good hair. Now that's the kind that curls up and people call kinky hair. That's nappy hair. If you ain't got that kind of hair on that equator, you are in serious trouble. I'm telling you. And I know I was there, and I can see why the human family developed this good hair that happened to us in Africa. So always remember that. And our characteristics are basically African, we as African Americans. But we've changed over the years. There's a lot of intermixing, racial mixing, but the fact of the matter is that the human family is monogenetic, that it began in Africa, and that we are all African people. Now, what happened then is that once we moved out of our native habitats, moved into other parts of the world, well, one year I went to Uganda, and I went to the source of the White Nile River. One is in Ethiopia,